The Ed Sullivan Theater crackled with energy as cameras swept across the enthusiastic crowd. Stephen Colbert stepped onto the stage with his signature grin, soaking in the applause before settling behind his desk. Across from him sat Karoline Leavitt, the 25-year-old White House press secretary, whose appearance on The Late Show had stirred considerable buzz, especially given the show's progressive reputation. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, Leavitt exuded calm confidence, a striking presence considering the high-pressure environment and expectations of a combative exchange. The air was thick with anticipation. Here was the youngest press secretary in American history, stepping onto a platform known for its sharp political satire aimed at her administration. Colbert leaned forward, his comedic timing as precise as ever. "You're the youngest press secretary ever," he began, pausing just enough to build suspense. "So tell me, what's it like being the adult supervision in this White House?" Laughter exploded from the audience. The jab was unmistakable. Cameras zoomed in as a flicker of something crossed Leavitt's face, not shock, not indignation, but a sharpened focus that even Colbert seemed to notice. She shifted in her seat, not in retreat but in resolve. In that quiet moment, the dynamic subtly shifted. What followed wasn't the typical political banter. Instead, the conversation took an unexpected turn, one that silenced the crowd and captivated millions online. A viral exchange unfolded that challenged partisan expectations and opened new doors for authentic political discourse. For nearly 2 decades, Stephen Colbert has been a towering figure in political comedy. From his satirical beginnings on The Daily Show to his iconic role on The Colbert Report and now as host of The Late Show, Colbert has carved out a niche as a sharp-witted voice of progressive America. Known for skewering conservative guests with incisive humor and relentless questioning, he embodies a brand of political satire that appeals strongly to urban, liberal audiences who tune in expecting to see ideological opponents held to account. At 59, Colbert is a symbol of the mainstream liberal media, admired by many on the left, distrusted by many on the right. His interviews with right-leaning figures often go viral for the way he exposes perceived contradictions or challenges their credibility with a smile and a zinger. Enter Karoline Leavitt. Just 25 years old, Leavitt is the youngest press secretary in U.S. history and a rising star in conservative politics. A former assistant press secretary in the previous administration, she made headlines upon her return to the White House, this time at the helm of the press operation. Her rapid rise drew both praise and skepticism. Supporters applauded her confidence and communication skills, while critics questioned whether someone so young could carry the weight of such a pivotal role. Raised in a modest New Hampshire town, Leavitt's background sharply contrasts with the elite coastal culture that surrounds Colbert and much of his audience. Her appearance on The Late Show was more than just a media booking, it was a cultural collision. The stakes were high on both sides. For Colbert, this was a chance to challenge a prominent face of an administration his viewers generally oppose. His team had likely armed him with questions meant to spotlight Leavitt's age and supposed inexperience, all while keeping the audience entertained. For Leavitt, however, the moment was bigger than any single interview. She wasn't just defending herself, she was representing the administration, its policies, and its values before an audience primed to be critical. Her performance could influence public opinion and reshape perceptions of who she is and what she stands for. No one expected what happened next. What began as a conventional political interview evolved into a viral exchange that defied expectations and left both the studio and online audiences reconsidering their assumptions about youth, experience, and the nature of political discourse in America today. A misstep could have been costly. A poor showing by Karoline Leavitt had the potential to validate critics who questioned her readiness for the role. A defensive or flustered reaction might have produced viral soundbites, fodder for weeks of headlines and social media ridicule that could distract from the administration's broader messaging. But the stakes were more than personal. This interview was emblematic of something much larger, a snapshot of America's deeply divided political landscape. Audiences tuned in with clear expectations. Colbert's progressive base anticipated an aggressive grilling of a young conservative official. Meanwhile, right-leaning viewers expected Leavitt to be treated unfairly, yet again, by the liberal media. Everything about the moment seemed poised to reinforce the nation's widening ideological fault lines. The producers at The Late Show recognized the high stakes. They had allotted an extended segment for the interview, anticipating the potential for a tense and headline-grabbing exchange. In the control room, the mood was focused. Directors prepared for a clash, one likely to light up social media, and draw millions of views. No one anticipated what actually unfolded. Colbert's opening line, laced with humor and challenge, echoed through the studio. Laughter rippled across the crowd. It was the type of opener designed to knock a political guest off balance. Leavitt, however, didn't blink. "That's actually a fair question, Stephen," she began calmly, her tone measured but firm. "Though I suspect not for the reasons your writers intended when they wrote it." Her unexpected poise stunned the room. Colbert, clearly caught off guard, had expected either a defensive counter or a polished deflection, both common responses in this high-pressure format. "My writers are innocent," Colbert quipped quickly, regaining his rhythm. "They're just kids themselves, much like your administration's economic policy team, from what I hear." The audience laughed. The tension eased slightly. Colbert settled back into his seat, believing the familiar rhythm of guest versus host had been restored. But Leavitt wasn't playing to that script. "You know, I've watched your show for years," she said sincerely, prompting a wave of surprise from the crowd. "Even when I've disagreed with your take, I've always respected how you use humor to elevate political conversation. That's why I chose to be here, despite knowing this wouldn't be easy." Colbert nodded, momentarily disarmed by the candor. Then he leaned forward again, shifting to a tougher line of questioning. "Speaking of challenges, let's talk about your qualifications," he said. "Most press secretaries have decades of experience before stepping up to that podium. You were in college just a few years ago. What qualifies someone your age to speak on behalf of the most powerful office in the world?" It was a familiar question, one that had dogged Leavitt since her historic appointment. The audience leaned in, waiting for either a tightly rehearsed soundbite or a crack in her composure. What came next would surprise them all. "I was wondering how long it would take before my age came up," Karoline Leavitt said with a calm smile. 3 minutes and 20 seconds, not bad. Longer than I expected." The audience chuckled, but this time the laughter wasn't mocking. It was appreciative. Leavitt's self-awareness and quick wit had shifted the tone. She wasn't rattled. She was ready. "Let me speak to this directly," she continued, her voice gaining momentum. "The average age in Congress is 59, your age, Stephen. In the Senate, it's 65. The average cable news viewer? Over 60. But the median age of Americans is 38. And the issues we're facing today, AI and automation, climate change, shifting global economies, these will affect younger generations more than anyone else." Colbert leaned in, ready with a quip, but Leavitt held her ground, gently raising a hand. "If I may finish this thought." She didn't flinch or falter. "My job isn't to claim more wisdom than those with decades of experience. It's to ensure that the views and stakes of my generation are present in the rooms where the future is being decided. The real question isn't whether someone my age belongs at the table, but whether the table can truly represent the country if voices like mine aren't included." The studio quieted. Gone was the setup for the next punchline. In its place was a moment of thoughtful engagement. Colbert, sensing the shift, adjusted his tone. "That's well said," he acknowledged. "But clarity of expression isn't the same as experience. When there's a national security crisis, do you really believe your perspective holds the same weight as someone who's been through it before?" "Of course experience matters," Leavitt replied. "That's why the president surrounds himself with seasoned advisors in diplomacy, intelligence, and military affairs. I don't pretend to replace their expertise. My role is to convey their insight clearly and to ensure younger perspectives are part of the conversation, especially when policies being shaped today will define the lives of generations to come." She leaned forward slightly, her voice still composed. "But since we're talking about qualifications, I have a question for you, Stephen. What life experiences prepared you to shape political discourse for millions every night? You studied philosophy and theater, did improv comedy, then transitioned into television. That's not exactly a conventional path to political influence either." There was a hum of reaction from the audience, a moment of surprise. Leavitt wasn't deflecting. She was flipping the lens, not in confrontation, but in reflection, raising an important question about which backgrounds we choose to scrutinize and why. Colbert smiled knowingly. "Touché," he said. "You're right. I've been influencing political thought without a poli-sci degree for years." Then he added, pivoting back into interviewer mode, "But I'm not speaking on behalf of the president." Leavitt nodded. "No, you're speaking to millions of Americans for nights a week. Through comedy and commentary, you help shape how they understand the world. That's a responsibility too." The conversation had left behind the usual playbook. What started as a setup for viral moments had evolved into something deeper, an exchange that challenged assumptions, exposed the limits of conventional criticism, and reminded viewers that real dialogue requires listening, not just performance. Recognizing that the usual one-liners weren't landing against this unusually prepared guest, Colbert shifted gears, moving from gotcha questions to genuine policy substance. "I was curious how long it would take before we got to my age," Karoline Leavitt remarked with a composed smile. 3 minutes and 20 seconds, not bad. Honestly, longer than I thought. The audience laughed, not at her, but with her. The humor landed differently this time. Leavitt's composure and self-awareness had shifted the energy in the room. She wasn't flustered. She was firmly in control. "Let me address that head-on," she continued, her tone sharpening with purpose. "The average age in Congress is 59, your age, Stephen. In the Senate, it's 65. The average age of a cable news viewer? Over 60. Yet the median age of Americans is 38. And it's my generation that will bear the brunt of what's coming: automation, climate instability, global economic shifts. These aren't distant concerns. They're our reality." Colbert leaned forward with a glint in his eye, poised for a comedic jab, but Leavitt raised a hand gently and continued with quiet authority. "If I may finish," she said, not challengingly, but firmly. "I'm not here to claim I know more than those with decades of experience. My responsibility is to make sure the voices of people my age are heard in rooms where decisions about our future are being made. The real issue isn't whether someone my age belongs at the table. It's whether that table reflects the country it claims to represent if it excludes younger voices." A hush settled over the studio. The tone of the conversation had shifted from performance to substance. Colbert, sensing the change, responded more thoughtfully. "Well said," he admitted. "But clarity isn't the same as experience. In times of national crisis, do you truly believe your perspective holds the same weight as someone who's been through it all before?" "Experience absolutely matters," Leavitt replied. "That's why the president relies on seasoned advisors, experts in foreign affairs, defense, intelligence. I don't replace their insight. I help communicate it. And I make sure younger generations aren't left out of the policy conversation, especially when it's their future on the line." Then, with a slight forward lean, she flipped the narrative. "But Stephen, since we're discussing qualifications, may I ask, what prepared you to shape the political views of millions every night? You studied philosophy and theater, did improv comedy, and ended up on late-night television. That's not exactly a traditional path to political influence either." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. It wasn't an attack. It was an honest question, one that highlighted how society often scrutinizes unconventional paths selectively. Colbert smiled, conceding the point. "Touché. Fair enough. I've been shaping political thought without a political science degree for years." Then, with a quick pivot back to his role, he added, "But I'm not the one speaking on behalf of the president." Leavitt nodded. "True. But you do speak to millions of Americans for nights a week. You shape how they see the world, through jokes, interviews, commentary. I'd say that carries a real responsibility too." The conversation had transcended its original format. What began as a potentially hostile interview had evolved into a meaningful exchange, one that challenged assumptions, pushed past surface-level jabs, and modeled what genuine dialogue could look like in a divided political landscape. Colbert, recognizing that the usual jabs weren't landing against such a prepared and thoughtful guest, adapted, stepping away from one-liners and into real, policy-driven engagement. "Before coming on tonight," Karoline Leavitt began, "I watched clips of your 2016 interview with President Obama. You asked him some truly thoughtful questions about the burden of decision-making, about balancing public service with family life, and how the presidency changes the person who holds it." She paused briefly, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "They were insightful questions," she continued. "They treated public service as a noble calling, not just material for jokes. You honored the seriousness of the office while still bringing your unique humor and perspective." Stephen Colbert gave a small nod, visibly acknowledging the reference. He knew the moment she was talking about. "I realize my boss isn't your preferred president," Leavitt said calmly. "And I completely respect that. That's the beauty of democracy. But I want to speak not just as a press secretary or a Republican, but as an American who's genuinely concerned about the state of our national discourse." The studio had gone still. The audience, sensing sincerity, leaned in. "In recent years, we've lost something crucial," she continued. We've lost the ability to disagree over policy without assuming the worst about each other's character. We no longer see opposing views as honest differences, but as signs of ignorance or evil. She glanced briefly at Colbert, then at the audience. We've started treating political disagreement like a moral indictment. Colbert opened his mouth, perhaps ready with a light-hearted remark to ease the tension, but something in Leavitt's tone, steady and earnest, made him hold back. My generation has never really seen functional politics, she said. We've grown up watching gridlock, shutdowns, and rising hostility. And frankly, the adults in the room, and I say that intentionally, given how you opened this interview, haven't exactly shown us how to govern across differences. She leaned forward, not confrontationally, but with the quiet urgency of someone who believes what she's saying. Stephen, your platform is powerful. You can keep getting laughs by portraying half the country as either evil or stupid. It works, and your audience eats it up. But that kind of comedy also deepens our divides. She paused, her voice soft but unwavering. Or, you could use your voice, your talent, to help people see the humanity in those they disagree with. To show that even through a progressive lens, we can recognize that disagreement doesn't have to mean disdain. That we're still one country, even if we argue about what it should be. Silence swept across the theater. The usual rhythm of late-night sparring had been replaced by something deeper. Something real. And for a moment, no one said a word. It wasn't the kind of silence that follows a joke falling flat. It was heavier and unexpected, thoughtful stillness in a space usually dominated by scripted sparring and punchlines. I came here tonight fully aware I'd likely be the punchline, Karoline Leavitt said, her voice steady but sincere. And I still showed up, because I believe we desperately need to start seeing each other as fellow Americans, not just as political enemies. The future of my generation depends on whether we can recover that basic ability. She offered a small smile, not defensive, but resolute. So yes, you can keep asking questions designed to make me look naive or uninformed. And I'll do my best to respond. But I think your audience deserves more than watching you try to humiliate someone who willingly walked into what we both know is, at best, unfriendly ground, hoping to show that real conversation across ideological lines is still possible. The silence deepened. Cameras caught the audience shifting, exchanging uncertain glances. This wasn't the clash they had come expecting. The energy in the room had shifted from anticipation of spectacle to reflection. Even Stephen Colbert, for a moment, seemed caught between his role as satirical commentator and the weight of the genuine challenge before him. Then, slowly, he placed his note cards aside. That's a fair point, he said, his voice quieter, more grounded. And probably something everyone in this business should sit with for a while. So, let's try something different. He leaned forward. What's one thing you wish people on my side of the political spectrum understood about your administration's goals? It was a clear pivot from aiming for viral takedowns to creating space for honest dialogue. The audience, initially primed for late-night combat, now found themselves witnessing something far more rare: mutual respect. Leavitt nodded, acknowledging the shift with quiet appreciation. I wish more Americans understood that. While we may differ on how to get there, this administration truly wants to create economic opportunity in all communities, strengthen our country's ability to innovate, and leave America more secure and prosperous for future generations, she said. We approach it differently than progressives, yes. But I believe our underlying goals, to expand opportunity, promote dignity, and strengthen the nation, aren't so far apart. She paused, then added with a grace that caught many off guard. And in the same spirit, I'll admit this, even though I don't always agree with progressive policies, I know they're often rooted in a sincere desire to build a more just and equitable society. We can debate the methods, but we should at least acknowledge the good faith behind the intentions. What had begun as a setup for public embarrassment had evolved into something altogether unexpected, a moment of clarity, of respect, of dialogue. And in a time when political discourse is too often reduced to viral jabs and shouting matches, that moment stood out, not as weakness, but as a glimpse of what real leadership and maturity can look like. It was a rare moment, an authentic connection that cut through the noise of partisan politics and offered a glimpse of what respectful, meaningful discourse might still look like in American public life. As the segment wrapped and Colbert thanked Karoline Leavitt for joining the show, the audience's applause carried a different tone. It wasn't the usual wave of partisan approval or performative cheer. It felt more sincere, an acknowledgement of something real, something unexpected. This wasn't just another late-night clash. It was a conversation that had dared to rise above the script. What began as an attempt to spotlight Leavitt's youth and presumed inexperience had instead revealed a poised young political figure capable of engaging with nuance, humility, and courage. Rather than shrink under pressure, she met it head-on, challenging not only her host's assumptions, but the entire framework of political entertainment designed to humiliate rather than understand. Clips of the exchange between Stephen Colbert and Karoline Leavitt went viral almost immediately, not because of fiery soundbites or partisan zingers, but because of the opposite. The conversation broke expectations. It was candid, respectful, substantive, and it resonated across political lines. Major news outlets quickly picked up the story, their headlines capturing the surprise of the moment. Late-night surprise. Colbert-Leavitt exchange transcends partisan divide. The Washington Post, 25-year-old press secretary flips the script on Colbert. The New York Times, from clash to conversation. How Leavitt shifted the tone. Politico inside the studio. The shift was just as palpable. As cameras stopped rolling, several audience members approached Leavitt, not to agree with her politics, but to thank her for showing up with honesty and grace in what had been presumed to be a hostile space. Later, posts on social media echoed that sentiment. Viewers who expected to disagree with her politically found themselves respecting her personally. On morning shows and political panels across networks, media analysts broke down the exchange. On CNN, political strategist David Axelrod noted, "What made this moment remarkable wasn't her defense of specific policies. It was that she stepped out of the partisan script and challenged all of us to do the same." The encounter served as a rare reminder that real conversation, grounded in respect, even amid disagreement, is still possible. And perhaps it's exactly what America is hungry for. What made Karoline Leavitt's appearance so remarkable wasn't just her poise under pressure, it was her ability to step beyond the usual script and challenge the very structure of political entertainment itself. She didn't simply answer Stephen Colbert's questions, she examined the assumptions behind them and questioned the broader norms of how political conversations are framed in the media. On Fox News, commentators praised her for staying composed while skillfully shifting the focus. She proved that conservative voices can hold their ground in mainstream media without becoming defensive or compromising their values, said analyst Dana Perino. But the impact of the exchange went far beyond party lines. Perhaps most notably, it sparked a broader conversation about the role of political media in deepening national divides. The Atlantic published a widely shared essay titled, "Entertainment versus Engagement: What the Colbert-Leavitt Moment Reveals About Political Media." The piece argued, our media landscape incentivizes theatrical conflict over meaningful discussion. But for a brief moment, Colbert and Leavitt showed that something more productive is possible when both participants are willing to step outside their roles. Within political strategy circles, the interview triggered real reflection. Democratic operatives, speaking off the record, acknowledged Leavitt's performance as a model of effective communication that reached beyond her base. She resonated with people who don't share her politics because she appealed to something deeper, a shared desire for functional democracy, a senior Democratic advisor told Politico. Every communicator in politics should take notes. For the administration, the interview was an unexpected but powerful messaging win. Media coverage that had previously fixated on Leavitt's age and relative inexperience now shifted to her communication skills and ability to navigate tough, even adversarial, environments. Several cabinet secretaries reportedly sought her input ahead of their own public appearances, impressed by her ability to stay principled yet relatable under pressure. Even Colbert reflected publicly on the exchange during the opening of his next show. "Something unusual happened at this desk last night," he told his viewers, "and I think it's worth talking about." It was a moment that not only redefined a single interview, but also revealed a path forward for political dialogue in a media landscape too often stuck in performative battles. A political guest challenged me to reflect on whether political entertainment, including this very show, may sometimes contribute to the divisions that make governance harder. "It's worth thinking about," I told the audience, even while keeping our humor and point of view. "I've spent my career building political satire. I still believe deeply in its power to help people process the chaos of our political reality. But there's a crucial difference between satire that speaks truth to power and content that merely reinforces partisan identities. I'm still working out where that boundary lies. Truthfully, so are many of us." The impact of that moment extended well beyond the night's episode. Universities across the country began incorporating the exchange into coursework on media studies and political communication. Professor Robert McChesney at the University of Illinois remarked, "This interview will be studied for years." It marked a rare moment when the script of political theater was broken by a sincere challenge to the foundations of that very theater. Both Colbert and Leavitt stepped beyond their expected roles and revealed a path toward more constructive discourse. For Karoline Leavitt, the interview transformed her public image. While critics continued to debate her policy stances, the conversation had shifted. She was now being engaged on the substance of her views rather than dismissed due to her age or inexperience. Major media outlets, consulting firms, and academic institutions reached out with job offers. Despite the attention, she remained committed to her duties as press secretary. Perhaps most notably, the moment prompted a wave of introspection across the media world. Several late-night hosts and political commentators privately reached out to Leavitt to express appreciation for her critique. A number of them reportedly adjusted their programming to allow for more meaningful dialogue with people outside their ideological bubbles. 6 months later, Leavitt and Colbert appeared side by side at a media ethics conference hosted by Columbia Journalism School. The conversation centered around a pressing question: how can political entertainment maintain its critical edge and sense of humor, while also contributing to a healthier, more constructive democratic conversation? That question remains. But for one night, on a late-night stage typically reserved for satire and sparring, two unlikely voices met in the middle, and something meaningful broke through. Their joint appearance, once unthinkable before their viral exchange, stood as powerful proof that meaningful engagement across ideological divides is not only possible, but deeply needed. What began as a seemingly routine late-night interview, marked by Stephen Colbert's sharp attempt to mock Karoline Leavitt, evolved into something far more impactful. Her poised response didn't just silence the audience, it reframed the conversation entirely. The moment transcended the typical partisan spectacle. It offered a glimpse of how Americans might begin to bridge their most entrenched divisions, not by surrendering their beliefs, but by acknowledging the sincerity and shared humanity of those on the other side. In an era increasingly shaped by political tribalism and media ecosystems that reward outrage over understanding, this exchange illuminated a different path. It reminded us that authentic dialogue, grounded in respect, not performance, is still within reach when people are willing to step beyond the roles the system scripts for them. If you found this breakdown of the Colbert-Leavitt exchange insightful, be sure to like and subscribe for more thoughtful analysis of today's defining political moments. Let us know in the comments. Could this kind of engagement be a model for healing America's divides? We'll continue tracking how this unlikely moment continues to influence national discourse and where it might lead next.